Hello and welcome to the Novel Analyst Podcast. I'm Jed Hearn and it is my job every episode to analyze a story to help you become a better writer. This episode is titled The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, Part 2, How to Write Funny. So, as mentioned in that Part 2 designation there, this is the second in a series of 2 episodes on The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the outrageously funny sci-fi comedy by Douglas Adams. And if you haven't watched the first part of this, no worries at all. This episode is about a very different subject matter that is still somewhat related to the first episode, so no need to go back and listen to that one, but if you do want to listen to it, great. So, in the previous episode, I talked a lot about how The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is one of the funniest books out there. If you're not familiar with the book, it's this sci-fi comedy about a everyman from Earth who leaves Earth after Earth is demolished to make way for this intergalactic space highway for this alien race, and wacky adventures ensure from there. It's absurd, it's hilarious, it's a very, very funny novel, widely regarded as one of the funniest novels out there, and it's kind of the gold standard for sci-fi comedy, I would say. And since this book is a very funny novel, I thought I would do something very serious and analyze why it's funny. In other words, I want to try to look at The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, often revered as an example of amazing comedy, and see if we can extract lessons and techniques from that to make our own writing funnier, to make more comedy for ourselves, to try to see if there is a way, if there even is a way to, use techniques to make something funny. And I think it's important to point out that ultimately humor is very subjective. I think that's probably something that you might be thinking right now. But, like with everything, I do think there are techniques you can use to increase the chance of a joke hitting the audience. And that's really what this episode is all about. It's how we can use techniques to boost our odds of making something funny. So I've divided this episode into 2 parts. The first part is going to look at micro techniques, so sentence level stuff, word level stuff, the actual wordsmithing that you use to deliver humor and that kind of thing. And then the second part of the episode is going to be about a couple of macro techniques, so bigger picture stuff, how to make funny scenes and sequences and overall plots and overall premises, overall characters, that sort of thing. So, first micro technique I'm going to be talking about today is this idea of the garden path. I'm not sure exactly where I read this, but I read it many years ago. And basically, it was like a comment on some writing advice website. I think it was on Superhero Nation, one of my favorite writing advice websites. And basically, the garden path method is where you lead readers to expect a certain outcome, and then you deliver another with the punchline. So an example from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy goes like this, quote, said Arthur, it's at times like this, when I'm trapped in a Vogan airlock with a man from Betelgeuse and about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young. Why? What did she tell you? I don't know. I didn't listen. End quote. So I love this because you really expect profound or at least some information at the end of the joke. Instead, you get irreverent nothingness. Here's another example that uses the same garden path technique. Quote, in the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. End quote. Again, you think that you'll get this sweeping, almost mystical creation story. Instead, you get a sense of pettiness and banality, which is sort of appropriate to the whole conceit and world of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Here's another example. Quote, Eskimos had over 200 different words for snow. Without much, their conversation would probably have got very monotonous. So they would distinguish between thin snow and thick snow, light snow and heavy snow, sludgy snow, brittle snow, snow that came in flurries, snow that came in drifts, snow that came in on the bottom of your neighbour's boots all over your nice clean igloo floor, the snows of winter, the snows of spring, the snows you remembered from your childhood that was so much better than any of your modern snow, fine snow, feathery snow, hill snow, valley snow, snow that falls in the morning, snow that falls at night, snow that falls all of a sudden just when you were going out fishing, and snow that despite all your efforts to train them, the huskies have pissed on. End quote. So this really illustrates the garden path technique very well, because the garden path technique is all about a value shift. So going from somber beginning to wacky end, or an irreverent beginning to a serious end, or a logical beginning to an absurd end. The value shift is what makes the garden path work. And with this quote, for instance, you kind of have like this kind of interesting look into sort of how environment shapes language, I suppose, and then at the end it ends with piston. So it goes from kind of this quite, I would suppose, semi-serious beginning to just this sort of like irreverent end. And there's, actually there's some nice profound stuff in this quote as well. Like, this is not necessarily a human-related technique, but there's that sentence in there, quote, "The snows you remembered from your childhood that were so much better than any of your modern snow," end quote. And this is one of the things that Douglas Adams does really well. And I'm going to pick on this a bit later in a good way. He just is able to embed a level of meaningfulness and seriousness in ostensibly comedic quotes and stuff. This is kind of attacking the whole rose-tinted goggles that people tend to get, the idea of nostalgia. So the garden path technique, all about making people expect something, leading them up the garden path to something, and then sort of like shoving them down the hill and delivering them something else instead. This also segues into the next technique, especially this quote I just gave then about all this snow, and then the snow that, despite all your efforts to train them, the Huskies have pissed on. And that is technique number 2. Emphasize on what comes last. So this is not so much a humor technique per se, but generally as a good rule of writing, as much as there are rules of writing, which there aren't really, generally the last word in a paragraph or a sentence has the most impact. So would take that sentence I just said, for instance. If I'd said, generally the most impact goes to the last word in a paragraph, you would have kind of lost the word impact. But by having impact last, it's more important, lets people kind of dwell on it for a second while they move on to the next sentence. So this is what we saw in that last quote. If we saw the Huskies have pissed on somewhere embedded in the middle of that very big chunk of paragraph, it wouldn't quite be as humorous because you don't really have the time to dwell on it. You don't really have that pause at the end of the sentence to think, oh, okay, that's pretty funny. But by having it at the very end, it lets people emphasize it a bit more. Humor technique number 3, micro technique number 3, is literal misinterpretation. So take a term normally used just to convey an idea, then actually follow through with the literal meaning. Quote from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the second book actually, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. "Gee, you guys are so unhip, it's a wonder your bums don't fall off." End quote. This is great because I think especially within the absurdist tone of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, taking things at their literal meaning is really good as well. There's another quote as well. Do I mention it later in the episode? I will... Yes, I do mention it later in the episode, I think. So I will save that for now. One of my favorite quotes. Micro technique number 4, fun with homophones. So according to TV Tropes, which is an excellent website and a place where you can definitely lose a lot of your time because it is hilarious. Quote, "A homophone is a word or phrase that sounds like or very similar to something different when spoken. It is a case of double meaning, but even harder to miss, especially when read and not heard." End quote. And the link to that article, which is called Fun with Homophones, is on the show notes for this episode. So here is a great example of homophones being used here. When Ford, one of the alien characters, tells Arthur, the human everyman kind of reader-standing character, that hyperspace is unpleasantly like being drunk. Arthur asks, quote, "What's so unpleasant about being drunk?" And Ford responds, "Ask a glass of water." End quote. Love that. Great example of how you can use the actual medium that you're writing in this case, kind of English here, to play with sort of the conventions and absurdities of the language to create an interesting level of absurdity and humor. Micro technique number 5, reframe. How can you make readers see a common thing or a common concept in a different and therefore more humorous, absurdist, satirical way? This is kind of the essence of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? It uses its sci-fi setting to kind of export human concerns to a place where they are just recognizable enough for you to understand what they're talking about, but they are sort of made larger than life and extravagant and dressed up in the sci-fi set dressings so that you are able to appreciate them more objectively than a novel that would just explore a quote-unquote real world. And I think this is the benefit of sci-fi and fantasy actually in general, is the ability to export ideas and concerns to a setting where they become more noticeable and therefore people can engage with them in a different way. So, for instance, there's this great piece in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where they satirized the human practice of making roads for cars to drive on. Quote, The disadvantages involved in pulling lots of black sticky slime out of the ground where it had been safely hidden out of harm's way, turning it into tar to cover the land with, smoke to fill the air with, and pouring the rest into the sea, all seemed to outweigh the advantages of being able to get more quickly from one place to another. End quote. Nice kind of environmentalist look at it there. Now, another one here that describes the Earth. Quote, "The fact that we live at the bottom of a deep gravity well, on the surface of a gas-covered planet, going around a nuclear fireball 90 million miles away, and think this to be normal, is obviously some indication of how skewed our perspective tends to be." End quote. Great example of reframing living on the Earth as this absurdist action. Again, another one here on the Earth. Quote, "Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea." End quote. And it's worth noting out that this reframe is a bit of a garden path method as well. You kind of have this progression from sweeping exploration of the universe down to ape descendants who like digital watches. Last micro technique here is for creating humor is oxymoron, the linking of two ideas which really don't make sense together. And the perfect quote to summarize this goes like this. Quote, "The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't." End quote. So, very similar, very taken for granted that writers like to use simile to describe things in a way that makes sense to readers, especially unfamiliar things like, say, sci-fi concepts as ships. But can you invert that by using an oxymoron? Can you describe ships hanging in the sky like the way that something else doesn't hang in the sky, and then create like a bit of double negative stuff there? That's a really cool technique as well. That's used quite a bit throughout the series. So to wrap up those 6 micro techniques for creating humor, we had the garden path technique, which is where you lead readers to expect something, then deliver something else. We had the emphasis on what comes last, which is just a generally good writing way of making sure readers focus on what you want them to focus on. The third one was this idea of literal misinterpretation, so taking a term normally just used to convey an idea and then actually following through with the meaning of that term. Number 4 was fun with homophones. Number 5 was reframing something to make it more absurdist or satirical. Worth pointing out that will obviously depend on kind of what level of humor you want in your story. And then the last one, number 6, was oxymoron, linking two ideas together, which really don't make sense next to each other. Now we'll move on to the macro techniques for creating humor. So the bigger picture stuff, how to make funny scenes, sequences, overall plots, that kind of thing. And number 1, I think this is very useful if you start from a place of genre awareness. So that's number 1. And Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy does this very well. It skewers a lot of science fiction genre tropes. And to be genre aware, generally the best way to do it is to just read a lot in your genre. And it's worth thinking about how you can analyze masterworks in your genre to better understand them, which is kind of what I do in the Novel Analyst podcast. It's a way for me to, as someone who really enjoys writing fantasy and science fiction, I analyze a lot of good fantasy and science fiction stuff to try to figure out how they do certain things and what makes them good, so that then I can apply the same lessons in my own writing. Another great resource for understanding genre and tropes and cliches, and it's worth pointing out that not all tropes are bad, in the same way that, all stories have tropes, just like how all trees have wood in them. You would never try to say, take the wood out of trees, because it's in every tree. Same way you shouldn't really be complaining necessarily about tropes. Tropes are not good or bad, it's just how they're executed, which makes them good or bad. Cliches, on the other hand, are kind of more of a derogatory term because it's a trope that is done in a bad way. So TV Tropes, which I will link to in the resources for this, is an excellent resource. It has articles on all manner of different tropes and cliches in your favorite stories and stuff. And I think it's very important to point that this whole idea of having genre awareness so that you can skewer a genre is not actually about hating on a genre. I think it's actually about having a deep love for your chosen genre, which is going to let you tear it to shreds all the better. Terry Pratchett is clearly someone who had a deep love for fantasy. It didn't stop him from absolutely savaging a lot of fantasy tropes, right? Macro technique number 2, escalation. What new level of crazy can you extrapolate things to? It's worth pointing out that there's always a line where it's too far and you wear out a joke, but done with caution and done with revisions and all that sensible stuff you should do as a writer anyway, this is a great technique. So, for example, in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I used this episode in part 1, but I'm going to use it again because it's a perfect example of escalation to create humor. Quote, "It is known that there are an infinite number of worlds, simply because there is an infinite amount of space for them to be in. However, not every one of them is inhabited. Therefore, there must be a finite number of inhabited worlds. Any finite number divided by infinity is as near to nothing as makes no odds, so the average population of all planets in the universe can be said to be 0. End quote. That's funny enough. That quote by itself had me laughing. But it doesn't stop there. The quote continues to escalate. Like this. Quote, "From this, it follows that the population of the whole universe is also 0, and that any people you meet from time to time are merely the products of a deranged imagination." Perfect example there of escalating things to take it to the next level of crazy/funny. And obviously, this is something you got to be careful with. You don't want to wear out a joke, but through revisions and stuff, you'll figure out the right length to take a joke to. Technique number 3, absurdism. So, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a hugely absurd novel, and absurdism is, I think I really like it because it just sort of pokes fun at how amusing some things are, and how, contradictory and sort of, I guess, like, not very logical and nonsensical things can be. So, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you see this perfectly in the opening setup, when this alien race called the Vogons demolish Earth to make way for an intergalactic superhighway. That's absurd enough by itself, but then there is more absurdity in how they justify it. So they say, quote, "All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display at your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years." End quote. Why did not the silly Earthlings see these plans? Obviously they were on display. The Vogons are super justified in doing this, right? So that's a great moment of absurdism because it actually reflects earlier in the novel where in the opening scenes, the main character's house gets demolished and he's saying, why wasn't I told about this? And the demolishers are like, oh, the planning permits have been in the town office for the last couple of weeks or whatever. And you see this just like hilarious kind of exporting of the same idea to a cosmic scale. Number 4, surprise, aka subverting expectations. Now, if you think about this, this is kind of what all these quotes have been about, and here's why. This is a quote from Jim Hardison in his Writer's Digest article, 7 Serious Tips for Writing a Humor-Filled Novel, which is linked to in the show notes. Quote, "Surprise is the essence of comedy. That's what a punchline is. A surprise. Surprises can be as simple as an unexpected end to a scene, an action, or even a sentence." End quote. So we've seen that throughout all of this stuff here, garden path technique. It's all about surprise. It's all about making readers think one thing, setting up a certain set of expectations, setting up a set, that was never going to go well, Jed. Basically establishing expectations and then doing the opposite, or following them, but following them in a way that is completely different to how you expected them to be followed. Number 5, this is the last kind of big macro technique, and arguably probably the most important technique to create a novel that is not just funny, but is also, good. And that is synthesis with the theme. So jokes shouldn't always be meaningless throwaways. It's really nice if they can actually link to the story's conceit, themes, and plot. So, again, in that article from Jim Hardison, 7 Serious Tips for Writing a Humor-Filled Novel, there's a really good quote that kind of sums this up. It goes like this, quote, "In the 4th Discworld novel, Mort reminds us don't fear the Reaper. Terry Pratchett once said that Mort was the first Discworld novel he really liked, because in the earlier books the plot was just there to support the jokes, whereas in Mort, the jokes were there to support the plot." End quote. So, Jim's talking about the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, which is arguably the fantasy counterpart to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's sort of like an absurdist fantasy version of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but with significantly more books. And basically what he's talking about here is the reason why Terry Pratchett liked the 4th Discworld novel more when he was working on it was because it kind of had this underlying, deeper, meaningful theme about not fearing the Reaper, not fearing death, but rather accepting that it's going to happen to you and not trying to escape it. Had to take a bit of water there because my voice was going croaky. Hope I'm not dying on you, which would be ironic. And what we see here is that if you can tie the jokes intricately into the theme of the story, and if you can create this underlying deeper meaning to each joke in your story, that's going to make your novel more interesting, and it's going to make the comedy better as well, because it's not going to just be this kind of quote-unquote cheap throwaway, one-liner stuff that's just designed to get a momentary endorphin rush in your readers. It's actually something that they will be able to come back to again, and even think about using these supposed jokes as sort of good ways to develop a personal philosophy and interact with the world. So in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the comedy is very much in service to the novel's wider theme that life, the universe, and everything is absurd, random, and weird, and that the sooner we start appreciating that, maybe the better we'll be. In the world of Douglas Adams, there's no point trying to figure out what the meaning of life is, because we won't be able to make sense of it when we discover the answer to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything is simply 42. Thank you for listening to the Novel Analyst podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate if you told a fellow person who is interested, I don't know where I was going with that, fellow would have been fine. I would really appreciate if you could tell a fellow or a friend or a find or frenemy or whatever who enjoys reading, who enjoys writing. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next time.